Ich sehe es 18:01 und 23 Sekunden. Wir versuchen pünktlich zu beginnen und ich freue mich sehr, sehr geehrter Herr Professor Boehm, sehr geehrter Herr Professor Dausner, sehr geehrter Herr Professor Wegner, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, Sie heute Abend hier in Schloss Herrenhausen im Namen der Volkswagen Stiftung begrüßen zu dürfen. Das Mikro meint es gut mit mir, man hört mich doppelt. Soll ich einfach weiterreden und dann hört es auf? Gut. Ja, genau. Die Volkswagen Stiftung darf heute Abend schon zum zweiten Mal Gastgeberin für einen Vortrag im Rahmen der mehrteiligen internationalen Vortragsreihe Universeller Humanismus, humaner Universalismus, normgebende Figuration zur Kritik von Antisemitismus sein. Und daher geht zunächst mein Dank ganz herzlich an die beiden Initiatoren der Reihe, Prof. Dr. Gerhard Wegner, dem niedersächsischen Landesbeauftragten gegen Antisemitismus und für den Schutz jüdischen Lebens, und Herrn Prof. Dr. René Dausner, Professor für systematische Theologie, Uni Hildesheim. Den beiden ist zu verdanken, dass wir heute Abend hier sind und in gewisser Weise, dass diese Vortragsreihe stattfinden konnte, auch einem ganzen Kreis an unterstützenden Institutionen der Universität Hildesheim, der Klosterkammer, der Hans-Lilje-Stiftung und dem niedersächsischen Justizministerium. Mein Dank geht aber natürlich auch an meine beiden Kolleginnen, Katja Ebeling und Nina Hane, die dafür gesorgt haben, dass der Abend hier heute organisiert wird. Ganz herzlichen Dank. Und der größte Dank geht selbstverständlich an den Referenten des heutigen Abends, Prof. Dr. Omri Boehm von der New School of Social Research in New York. Mit seiner unmittelbaren Nähe zum großen Garten, in dem einst der bedeutende Universalgelehrte Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Inspiration suchte, ist Schloss Herrenhausen, das wir auch das Explanatorium Schloss Herrenhausen nennen, ein, wie ich finde, sehr geeigneter Ort für den Vortrag eines Philosophen. An 100 Tagen im Jahr finden hier im Schloss Herrenhausen Veranstaltungen statt, die sich an eine wissenschaftliche oder wissenschaftlich interessierte Öffentlichkeit richten. Die Arbeit der Stiftung findet allerdings vor allem in einem Bau aus den 60er Jahren im Stadtteil Dören in Hannover statt. Und in diesem Gebäude steht ein offenes Bücherregal. Und in diesem offenen Bücherregal finden sich meistens Krimis, historische Romane oder auch Kinderbücher, die den Besitzer wechseln wollen. Und in diesem Bücherregal habe ich unmittelbar nach der Bundestagswahl das Buch Gegen den Hass von der Publizistin Caroline Emke gefunden und habe angefangen, es zu lesen, und ich musste sehr an den heutigen Abend denken, und deshalb möchte ich gerne aus dem Vorwort etwas zitieren. Manchmal frage ich mich, ob ich sie beneiden sollte. Manchmal frage ich mich, wie sie das können, so zu hassen, wie sie sich so sicher sein können. Denn das müssen die Hassenden sein, sicher. Sonst würden sie nicht so sprechen, so verletzen, so morden. Sonst könnten sie andere nicht so herabwürdigen, demütigen, angreifen. Sie müssen sich sicher sein, ohne jeden Zweifel. Am Hass zweifelnd lässt sich nicht hassend. Zweifelnd könnten sie nicht so außer sich sein. Um zu hassen, braucht es absolute Gewissheit. Jedes Vielleicht wäre das störend, jedes womöglich unterwanderte den Hass, zöge Energie ab, die doch gerade kanalisiert werden soll. Gehasst wird ungenau, präzise lässt sich nicht gut hassen. Mit der Präzision käme die Zartheit, das genaue Hinsehen oder Hinhören. Mit der Präzision käme jene Differenzierung, die die einzelne Person mit all ihren vielfältigen, widersprüchlichen Eigenschaften und Neigungen als menschliches Wesen erkennt. Dieses genaue Hinsehen, von dem Caroline Emke spricht, das ist so wichtig. Es ist so wichtig zu differenzieren und dem schier allgegenwärtig scheinenden Hass etwas entgegenzusetzen. Und so bin ich sehr dankbar, dass wir heute Abend einen Gegenentwurf hören werden, über einen Weg diskutieren werden, der aus dem Hass hinausführen könnte. Bevor wir aber den Vortrag heute Abend hören, möchte ich an Herrn Dausner übergeben, der noch weiter einführen wird.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, dear Omri Boehm, Erev Tov, vor fast genau einem halben Jahr, am 7. Oktober 2024, dem Jahrestag des Terrorangriffs der Hamas gegen Israel, begrüßte ich die US-amerikanische Historikerin Susanna Heschel hier ebenfalls im Schloss Herrenhausen als erste Rednerin unserer internationalen Vortragsreihe gegen Antisemitismus mit den folgenden Worten: The hour calls for high moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. Die Erinnerung an dieses Zitat, das einem Telegramm ihres Vaters, Abraham Joshua Heschel, vom 16. Juni 1963 entnommen ist und an den damaligen US-Präsidenten John F. Kennedy gerichtet war, hat hier und heute eine doppelte Funktion. Zum einen erlaubt mir der Rückgriff auf den Beginn unserer Vorlesungsreihe die Reminiszenz an den besagten 7. Oktober, den Susanna Heschel in ihrem Vortrag als einen der schlimmsten Tage der jüdischen Geschichte, als Tag des Abschlachtens und des Horrors beschrieben hat. Mit dem heutigen Vortrag knüpft Omri Boehm an dieses Datum sehr bewusst an und untersucht die Folgen und Auswirkungen aus philosophischer Sicht. Zum anderen charakterisiert der jüdische Rabbiner und Gelehrte, der Schulter an Schulter mit Martin Luther King Jr. an dem Wahlrechtsmarsch von Selma nach Montgomery vor 60 Jahren teilnehmen sollte, eine heute noch immer und vielleicht mehr denn je erforderliche theologisch-philosophische Haltung der moralischen Erhabenheit und Größe sowie der geistigen und geistlichen Kühnheit. Auch in dieser Hinsicht ist eine Spur zu Omri Boehm gelegt, der mit seinen Schriften und Vorträgen entschieden für Moralität und Menschenwürde eintritt und für einen radikalen Universalismus plädiert, der verstanden werden kann als metaphysischer Gedanke, dass die letzte Autorität bei der Wahrheit liegt. Vor dem Vortrag von Omri Boehm, den Gerhard Wegner vorstellen und einführen wird, werde ich Ihnen in wenigen Pinselstrichen die bisherigen Vorlesungen der internationalen Vortragsreihe skizzieren, um den heutigen Abend zu kontextualisieren. Das vornehmliche Ziel der Vortragsreihe insgesamt besteht in der kritischen Analyse und Reflexion politischer, theologischer und philosophischer Argumentationen, die einen universellen Humanismus begründen. Zugleich soll die Rolle eines humanen Universalismus bedacht, dessen massive Infragestellung durch den Antisemitismus beleuchtet und sowohl produktiv als auch kritisch in den öffentlichen Diskurs eingebracht werden. Was sich an dieser nur kurz skizzierten Problemlage zeigt, ist, dass Antisemitismus einerseits eine singuläre Erscheinung ist, die sich in keiner Weise unter Formen von Rassismus subsumieren ließe. Andererseits gilt es zu konstatieren, dass der Antisemitismus mit den Worten des französischen Philosophen Immanuel Levinas gesagt, durch denselben Hass gegen den Humanismus des anderen Menschen charakterisiert ist. Also auch hier eine Bezugnahme auf diesen Hass, von dem Sie vorhin gesprochen haben. Antisemitismus wirft die Frage auf nach der universellen Geltung menschlicher Würde und gleichen Rechten aller Menschen oder, was dasselbe bedeutet, die Frage nach der Menschlichkeit des Menschen überhaupt. Auch wenn in manchen postkolonialen Diskursen der Kampf gegen Rassismus im Namen universaler Prinzipien dahin zu tendieren scheint, den Hass gegen Juden und Jüdinnen zu legitimieren, impliziert der Kampf gegen Antisemitismus aus unserer Sicht umgekehrt stets eine Absage an jede Form von Rassismus. In dem bereits genannten ersten Vortrag hat Susanna Heschel den Antisemitismus als eine Kultur des Sadismus charakterisiert und damit ein neues Forschungsfeld skizziert. Der Sadismus erzeuge eine perverse Beziehung, insofern die ständige Obsession mit antisemitischen Vorstellungen und Fantasien im Bewusstsein der Antisemiten eine fantasierte, emotionale, intime Beziehung zu den Juden schaffe, die nicht anders als Besessenheit beschrieben werden könne. Mit Blick auf die Aufklärung machte Susanna Heschel deutlich, dass der Bezug auf den Rationalismus unzureichend sei, wenn nicht auch die Emotionalität berücksichtigt wird. Antisemitismus entfalte seine fast erotische Anziehungskraft angesichts der jahrhundertelangen Stereotype und Vorurteile. Da Antisemitismus die letzten 2000 Jahre Teil der westlichen Zivilisation war, ist es eine einfache Methode geworden, um Hass, Abneigung und sogar Sadismus auszudrücken. Den Zusammenhang von Aufklärungsepoche und Antisemitismus vertiefte der Frankfurter Philosoph Christoph Menke in dem zweiten Vortrag über radikale Freiheit. Um den philosophischen Anteil an Antisemitismus und zugleich an dessen Überwindung zu untersuchen, unterschied Menke zwei Freiheitskonzeptionen. Ausgehend von dem Verständnis der Aufklärung als dem europäischen Geist der Moderne sei Freiheit im Sinne der Autonomie zu deuten. Allerdings dürfe diesem Freiheitsverständnis nicht Unfreiheit oder Knechtschaft gegenübergestellt werden, sondern, so Menke, ein anderes Verständnis von Freiheit, nämlich die Freiheit des Exodus, die dadurch gewonnen würde, dass das Subjekt sich einem unendlichen Gebot öffne und unterwerfe und dadurch aus der herrschenden Ordnung ausziehe. Christoph Menke exemplifiziert das Denken der einen Freiheit an dem jungen Hegel, das Denken der anderen Freiheit, die ein Freiwerden von Identitäten und Ordnungen ermögliche, also ganz im Sinne auch von Omri Boehm, an Franz Rosenzweig, an Hannah Arendt und an Immanuel Levinas. Der positive Sinn von Befreiung in diesem zweiten Verständnis bestehe darin, frei zu werden für eine Forderung der anderen, der wir nicht oder noch nicht gerecht zu werden vermögen. Im dritten Vortrag thematisiert Vivian Liska, die Germanistin aus Antwerpen, philosophische Phantasmen des Juden in kritischer Auseinandersetzung mit Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Blanchot sowie Alain Badiou und vor allem Giorgio Agamben rekonstruiert Liska die zunehmende Problematik der Universalisierung jüdischer Wurzellosigkeit als ein Ideal und ihre Entwicklung im Denken des 20. Jahrhunderts. Das Exil gilt dabei als meist verbreitete Form phantasmatischer Vorstellungen des Juden, die anfänglich auch sicher gut gemeint gewesen seien, sich aber mehr und mehr als eine Entterritorialisierung in philosophischen Diskursen von der Nachkriegszeit bis heute geführt habe. Die politische Philosophin Annabel Herzog aus Haifa analysierte in ihrem Vortrag die Figuren Heimat und Exil sowie ein Verständnis von Zugehörigkeit und politischem Raum anhand des Denkens von Hannah Arendt und Svetlana Boehm. Die unterschiedlichen Perspektiven versteht Herzog als komplementäre Antworten auf die Herausforderung, ein sinnvolles politisches Leben zu schaffen. Während Hannah Arendt den Heimatverlust als Verlust an Fähigkeiten wahrnahm, die eigene Welt zu verstehen, bildete für Svetlana Boehm Heimat keinen festen Ort, der eine Rückkehr ermöglichte, sondern eine Art, den Raum zu bewohnen und sowohl den Verlust markiere, als auch neue Möglichkeiten erschließe. Die beiden unterschiedlichen Reflexionen über jüdische Erfahrungen böten, so Annabel Herzog, die Gelegenheit, eine neue Zukunft des politischen Lebens zu lernen, die produktiven Spannungen zwischen Verwurzelung und Verdrängung, zwischen Intimität und Distanz, zwischen privater und öffentlicher Sphäre auszuhalten. Die politische Philosophin Donatella di Cesare aus Rom reflektierte in dem 4. und jüngsten Vortrag vor genau einem Monat unserer Vorlesungsreihe das jüdische Bewusstsein auf dem Prüfstein von Gaza. Nicht ohne Rückgriff auf den 7. Oktober als eine historische Zäsur, sowohl für Israelis als auch für Jüdinnen und Juden, aber eben auch für Palästinenserinnen und Palästinenser, selbstkritisch zu thematisieren, erörterte die Cesare die aktuellen Entwicklungen, die einem ständig anwachsenden Antisemitismus Vorschub leisten. In einem Doppelinterview, und damit leite ich zu dem heutigen Vortrag über, das Donatella di Cesare und Omri Boehm gemeinsam und in einem notwendigen Streit über Argumente im August 2023, also 2 Monate vor der Zäsur des 7. Oktober, der Wochenzeitung Die Zeit gegeben haben, erklärte die Cesare programmatisch, Philosophie solle ihrer Ansicht nach nicht mehr im akademischen Schutzwall eingeschlossen sein, sondern es sei Zeit, dass die Philosophie in die Polis zurückkehre. Omri Boehm stimmt diesem Befund zu, insofern auch er die Philosophie nicht mehr in der Polis verortet sieht und es als eine Frage der Zukunft des Westens erkennt, ob und wenn ja, inwiefern eine Rückkehr möglich sei. Und zwar eine Rückkehr in die Polis, eine Rückkehr in die Stadt. Im Hintergrund steht Walter Benjamin, der sozusagen Philosophie aus der Großstadt betrieben hat. Nachdem wir vor einem Monat nun also Donatella di Cesare in der Landeshauptstadt Hannover zu Gast hatten und mit ihr das Konzept einer verantwortungsbewussten politischen Philosophie diskutieren konnten, freuen wir uns nun und heute Abend auf den Vortrag von Omri Boehm. Erlauben Sie mir einen Ausblick auf den Mai. Das wird dann der 7. Vortrag sein und damit verbinde ich gleichzeitig auch eine Einladung an Sie alle. Nathan Schneider aus Tel Aviv wird über die Würde und Bürde der jüdischen Existenz sprechen, das heißt über Leben zwischen Anpassung und Autonomie. Herzliche Einladung, 15.05. Das ist, Achtung, ein Donnerstag, kein Montag wie sonst, also ein Donnerstagabend, 18 Uhr in Hildesheim in der Domäne im Hohen Haus. Mit diesem Ausblick übergebe ich nun an meinen Kollegen Prof. Dr. Gerhard Wegner, niedersächsischer Landesbeauftragter gegen Antisemitismus und für den Schutz jüdischen Lebens, der Ihnen nun Prof. Dr. Omri Boehm vorstellen wird. Bitte schön, Gerd, du hast das Wort.
Ja, lieber René, vielen Dank, meine Damen und Herren. Wir haben eben schon diskutiert, ob der Vortrag von Herrn Schneider der 6. oder der 7. ist. Du hast jetzt wieder 7. gesagt. Also hier sind 6, ne, wenn ich richtig zähle. Okay, naja, macht ja nichts. Aber 7, naja, ist ja auch gut. Okay, meine Damen und Herren, wir machen spannend, bis es zum Vortrag von Omri Boehm kommt. Ich möchte Ihnen, Herrn Boehm, ein bisschen vorstellen, soweit man das überhaupt machen kann. Omri Boehm ist ein Philosoph und Hochschullehrer in New York. Er ist Israeli, er ist Deutscher. Ein Kosmopolit, morgen redet er in Oslo und übermorgen, ich weiß nicht wo, also ist viel unterwegs und es ist großartig, dass Sie heute hier sein können, lieber Herr Boehm, und mit uns Ihre Gedanken hier heute teilen können. Sie sind in Israel geboren, in Israel aufgewachsen, Sie haben Ihren Wehrdienst in Israel abgeleistet. Sie studierten an der Universität Tel Aviv und wurden 2009 über Kants Spinoza-Kritik an der Yale University in Philosophie promoviert. Eine Stelle als Postdoktorand führte sie dann an die Universität München. Sie lehren seit 2010 als Associate Professor Philosophie an der New Yorker New School of Social Research. Sie publizierten unter anderem zu Baruch de Spinoza über René Descartes und Immanuel Kant. In den im Jahr 2020 veröffentlichten Buch A Future for Israel Beyond the Two-State Solution, wir haben da heute schon drüber diskutiert, plädiert Boehm für einen föderalen binationalen Staat, Republik Haifa, als Alternative zur Zwei-Staaten-Lösung, die er für gescheitert hält. Immer wieder diskutieren wir über diese Fragen hier auch in Hannover. Für das 2022 in deutscher Übersetzung erschienene Buch Radikaler Universalismus, jenseits von Identität, Universalismus als rettende Alternative, erhielten sie 2024 den Leipziger Buchpreis zur europäischen Verständigung. Sie leben in den Vereinigten Staaten, besitzen aber die deutsche und israelische Staatsbürgerschaft. Sie vertreten in ihren politischen Positionen und Ideen einen radikalen Universalismus, der traditionelle Konzepte von Identität und persönlichen Rechten infrage stellt. Sie argumentieren gegen die konventionelle Auffassung des Universalismus in westlichen liberalen Demokratien und behaupten, dass diese lediglich eine leere Hülle seien, die den eigenen Interessen dient und die Idee der Menschheit bedroht. Sie setzen sich für einen wahren Universalismus ein, der aus verschiedenen historischen Quellen universelle Grundlagen des Handelns, der Ethik ableitet, darunter die amerikanische Unabhängigkeitserklärung, die Schriften Immanuel Kants und interessanterweise immer wieder biblische Erzählungen, so die berühmte Geschichte von Abraham und Isaak, die Sie, wie Sie vorhin erzählt haben, von Anfang an in ihrem philosophischen Nachdenken in den Mittelpunkt ihrer Überlegungen stellen. Wer sich daran näher beteiligen will, findet in der FAZ immer wieder Beiträge zur Diskussion über die Deutung dieser Geschichte durch Omri Boehm. Sie betonen individuelle Autonomie und Selbstbestimmung sowie die Überlegenheit der Gerechtigkeit über alle Autoritäten. Ihr Werk ist ein wichtiger Beitrag zur Stärkung der Idee von Pflichten gegenüber Rechten und zur Suche nach einer nicht nihilistischen Lösung für die aktuellen gesellschaftlichen Gegensätze. Und dieser letzte Satz leitet schon über zu dem, was wir jetzt gleich von Ihnen zu hören bekommen. Ich kann Sie darauf vorbereiten, meine Damen und Herren, dass dies ein unwahrscheinlich spannender Vortrag sein wird, der unmittelbar in die gegenwärtigen Auseinandersetzungen, mit denen wir alle zu tun haben, diesseits und jenseits des Atlantiks und diesseits und jenseits des Mittelmeers uns führen wird. Seien Sie also gespannt auf das, was Omri Boehm jetzt gleich uns vortragen wird. Der Vortrag wird in Englisch sein, aber wir haben das Glück, dass Herr Boehm ihn rechtzeitig uns geschickt hat, sodass wir den Vortrag haben ins Deutsche übersetzen können. Sie finden oben und hier vorne Exemplare, Kopien des Vortrages ausliegen. Sie können das also in Deutsch nachverfolgen, wenn Sie möchten. Die Übersetzung ist aber nicht autorisiert, die ist von mir. Alle Fehler gehen auf mich, also nicht auf Herrn Boehm. Und bitte geben Sie diesen Text auch nicht weiter, der ist nicht für die Veröffentlichung gedacht, sondern lediglich zum privaten Gebrauch hier heute Abend während der Vorlesung. Und nun, dear Omri Boehm, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm really delighted with the long list of names that has been mentioned here, not just of the people who came here to speak, though very much them too, but I'm delighted to hear the name of Caroline Emke, somehow introducing my work. Caroline is a friend and someone that I admire. By the way, I think it is a very interesting question that someone like me has to consider. You mentioned the how hate requires certainty. People sometimes accuse me that my radical universalism, to the extent that it requires a concept of truth, and even self-evident truth, can fall back into a position that is fundamentalist because it has certainty. And that is actually a challenge that I think about, and I think I need to think about a lot in my work. And actually some of the things that I will say here indirectly are relevant to that mention of Caroline's point there with certainty and hate. I'm especially delighted with this long list of people who spoke before me. Some of them are personal friends or people that I know well and really admire. With some of them I agree more, some less. It's good to see Nathan Schneider coming to speak here next month, someone with whom I've had massive debates. We agree probably about nothing, but love very, very much to discuss in true friendship and real friendship. And yes, thank you for including me in this wonderful series. I will be reading in English for 45 minutes, and I'm happy to discuss questions posed later also in German. The pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus is reputed to have once said that war is, and this is a quote, it's a familiar quote, that war is the father of all things. Pessimistic propositions of this sort, for some reason, always tend to sound realistic. They determine that power, not reason, is real, that violence is the origin of everything, that war is the metaphysical truth that you discover whenever you scratch the facade of friendly, peaceful appearances, that is, if you're one of the lucky few who enjoy such appearances, rather than war's horrifying realities. Bearing that image in mind, you might call Kant, Immanuel Kant, the anti-Heraclitus. He denounced war as barbaric in the strict philosophical sense of the term. It is a way of savages, to be sure, European nations included, insofar as they settle human affairs by, quote, force without freedom or law. Kant would identify Thomas Hobbes's idea of sovereignty and the image of Leviathan that was adequately chosen to represent it as a modern continuation of Heraclitus' attachment to war. Leviathan, that mythical sovereign, is born out of the bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all, which Hobbes thinks stands as the origin of rational politics and is the natural state of humanity, its father, so to speak. In this sense, war of all against all designates the reality of humanity, which we only artificially paint over by using reason as the way to overcome our fear from violent death. That is, our fear of getting murdered and slaughtered by another powerful human. This image of reason and humanity is no genuine alternative to barbarism, Kant would argue, but its continuation, because understood in this way, reason stands on the same spectrum of power and violence, a tool to respond to the fear that itself determines wise animals, not a faculty that can be genuinely interpreted as the alternative to violence, as an expression of freedom, a faculty that is capable of setting its own ends, its own goals, rather than being determined by the ends provided to it, dictated to it by fear. The opposition to barbarism then is inseparable from overcoming war by grounding laws not in the concrete experience of fear, but rather in the consciousness of freedom and the corresponding ideal of human dignity. Humans have dignity because they are primarily free, not because they are capable of responding to fear, something that animals can do. This alternative, fear versus dignity, makes up an important difference because it entails a rejection of Leviathan, a denial of Hobbes, and we can already look forward and say the Hobbes-Schmittian commitment to sovereign power, and the temptation posed by Leviathan's ability to maintain the rule of law in a positivist sense as a guardian against violence. As we will see, Kant posits that any rule of law worthy of the name requires the denial of such blind positivism, and this denial necessitates, in turn, the authority of international, cosmopolitan law, a challenge to sovereign authority. A rule of law, Rechtsstaatlichkeit, a rule of law in Kant's sense then, depends not on Leviathan's positivist legislation, but on justice and the ideal of peace. So justice and peace, interpreted as the inherent relation between positive law and human dignity. So justice and peace and the rule of law cannot be separated from one another, as so often they do, where law doesn't have the form of justice or the form of peace, something I'll be talking about. It is not a law, but a command. So a Befehl, eine Befehl, nicht Gesetz. It has power, maybe, but not authority. Since this notion requires actual legislation, not just within states, but between them, requires peace, it gives rise to the utopian idea of a world federation of states. Sovereign powers are supposed to resolve the conflicts between them like citizens do, so to speak, by law, not by violence, by international court, not by war, by police, not by military. In this way, grounding law in the ideal of dignity, Kant, rather than fear of war, Heraclitus, Hobbes, Schmidt, entails a commitment to the idea of international cosmopolitan law making at least possible, and those are now quotes from Kant, universal and lasting, and indeed eternal or perpetual peace. Hence Kant's famous zum ewigen Frieden. To be sure, Kant did not think that achieving such a peace was actually likely in real history. But he contested the thought, and that's something I will be talking about today later on. He contested the thought that this makes this notion any less real, any less binding for us. So here is roughly how the talk is going to unfold. First, I would like to say a few words on the notion of human dignity. Somewhat surprisingly, it was introduced, almost discovered, in modern politics and modern law very late. In fact, it was introduced into modern legislation only after the Holocaust and in response to its horrors. That's sometimes surprising to people who know the literature. But the emergence of this notion in national and international law and international treaties, and the consequence of this introduction, were by far the most robust attempt to enshrine nie wieder, never again, into human existence. I will suggest that when properly understood, this notion, dignity, Würde, acquires, once incorporated into law, a utopian potential. And I'll say a word of what utopia here means. However, I will then speak of the impossibility of grounding that notion, Würde, dignity, in any naturalist modern framework, leading us to the attempt, I think insufficient, to ground that doctrine in historical consciousness, in historical commitment. And so we face a situation in which, on the one hand, we appeal to human dignity as the origin of our politics and our norms, and on the other, it tends to fail our robust post-war post-Holocaust commitments. I will then conclude by trying to show how, in the context of the current memory and culture wars over October 7th and Gaza, both of them, this appeal to history faces not just a limitation, but a real downfall. The only way to protect humanism and international cosmopolitan law, then, is to insist that even if we came to learn their importance through history and memory, Holocaust, colonialism, that notion still cannot be grounded in this commitment. It must be grounded in the ideal of dignity, not in a response to history, not in historical commitments. All right, I'd like to begin by reading an assortment of propositions. I think you all are likely to know all of them. First, we hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a well-known second sentence from the preamble of the American Declaration of Independence. I've quoted it almost too often, I know. And so consider also the first clause of German Grundgesetz, also something I quote almost too often. Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. Sie zu achten und zu schützen ist Verpflichtung aller staatlichen Gewalt. The same proposition about human dignity is repeated not just in German basic law, but in the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights and in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights of December 10th, 1948, which similarly appeals to human dignity in its first clause, and I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." The preamble of the UN's Universal Declaration also opens by stating its, and I'm quoting again, "the faith in the fundamental human right and in the dignity and worth of the human person." End quote. Now, I'm not going to ask here how many of you in the audience actually support these statements. How many of you actually believe that they are true? Rather, I'd like to ask, if you support them, why? What grounds the truth asserted in the Declaration of Independence, let alone their self-evidence? What sustains the proposition that humans have inviolable dignity? Is it science? Is it faith? And if you don't really have a good answer, is your conviction that all humans are equal in dignity and worth, as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights proposes, is it better than any blind religion? It isn't easy to answer these questions, and a moment before I say more about this, and I will, and for those of you who've read my book, don't worry, I will not stay with a book. A moment before I will say more about this, I'd like to mention a different fact. When I ask my students nowadays the same questions, and I do, more so after October 7th, the debates are getting heated, it is striking that none of them would raise a hand to support these propositions in the first place. They all associate them as ideological statements of the West's Enlightenment universalism, which they reject. My students complain that the authors of the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders, that Kant himself was a racist. That's a famous topic of the German papers. The students claim that all men are created equal means literally men and exclusively white. In short, for those of you who think this is ridiculous or something for post-colonial theory, in short, they claim that Enlightenment universalism isn't the guardian of human rights, but just the opposite. At best, It's a hypocritical ideology that tolerates white supremacy. At worst, it is a supremacist tool used by the white West to colonize, occupy, expropriate, expel, and enslave. Now, I said, for those of you who, some people tend to frown upon that. Some people tend to say, yeah, the post-colonials. I already want to invite here a challenge to my friend Nathan Schneider, who's speaking here next month. Write down a question. What do you think about this? Right? Do you think that the Enlightenment is a way to emancipate Jews? Or is it a way to have an Anpassung, if not worse? The point is that the argument is exactly the same. The argument Enlightenment, right? The context, at least in Germany, I often find that when people roll their eyes when they hear about the post-colonialists who complain about the Enlightenment, they then completely understand, of course, a Jewish claim that Enlightenment did not bring liberation, but at best, Anpassung, at worst, extermination. Right? So the challenge is not empty. These then are the questions. Is a principle of human dignity, tied as it is to Enlightenment universalism, is it actually an expression of the white West's colonialism, racism, and anti-Semitism? Should we defend the idea of human dignity, or should we decolonize such documents as the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Is German basic law asserting human dignity as unantastbar the answer to past crimes? Or is it, in a deep sense, not the answer, but the cause? As again, post-colonials and someone like Nathan Schneider would argue. And I want to deliberately put here both positions together because I think that as a theoretical point, the argument is the same. And it shows you the difficulty of just dismissing one but accepting the other. And then if, after all, you do accept such notions, human dignity, universal human rights, enlightenment, if we can still stand by those ideas, back to the question, what is the ground? What grounds these ideals of dignity? Now, according to the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, our rights as humans were given to us by our, and this is a quote, Creator. Earlier in the text, the Founding Fathers, the American Founding Fathers, appeal also to the station given to us by nature's God, to the place we humans have in creation. The general strategy is familiar. The claim is that we are somehow created in God's image and likeness, and therefore are special in creation. But from the perspective of contemporary political thinking, grounding human dignity in our likeness to God is obviously futile, regardless of people's position on faith. That position cannot ground your politics in a modern state. The familiar modern move to defend rights has been to replace God by nature. In this sense, to replace religion by science. On this view, human beings have inalienable natural rights or inviolable dignity. That is, by nature, humans have a right, say, to their bodies. By nature, we have the right to freedom of speech. This appeal to nature rather than God may sound more convincing to modern ears, but it really shouldn't be. Within a pre-modern concept of nature, broadly speaking, a teleological or an Aristotelian one, when nature proceeds according to some good, a telos, it might make sense to appeal to nature in order to ground rights, norms, concepts like dignity. the inherent worth of human beings would be then derived from the station that they occupy in a natural order that is itself normatively infused, and so violating their rights is going against nature's moral purpose. It is wrong as an objective fact. But once modern science, the inheritance of enlightenment, delegitimized the Aristotelian teleological concept of nature, once we can no longer believe that there are ends in nature and blind mechanism takes over as the Enlightenment's only valid description of humanity, the idea of natural inalienable rights or inviolable dignity becomes as empty as the idea that humans receive their dignity from God. Talk of inviolable human dignity, die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar, that proposition thus becomes either deliberately fictional, at best the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adduces a bunch of noble lies. Blind evolution, the point is, blind evolution endows clever animals like us with all sorts of desires, powers, and urges, not with human rights or with inviolable human dignity. And the point is the following. If enlightenment is related to Western traditions of colonialism, enslavement, and extermination, rather than liberation, emancipation, and dignity, if enlightenment can be interpreted as such a movement, then the reason is not that it produced universalism, this alleged ideology of the white West, but precisely that it undermined this notion. The question is whether there is still a way to defend it in rational Enlightenment terms. And you're guessing correctly that this is where Immanuel Kant and his notion of humanity is going to make an appearance. But before I go into that, we need to notice a few things before. If neither God nor nature can help us think the notion of dignity, what are the other options? We still need to look at two strategies that are closely related to one another and, unlike God or nature, seem quite plausible to many, namely appealing to history, or relatedly appealing to grounding commitments in the decision of a political community to constitute itself in the light of some idea, by means of becoming conscious of its own historical duties, commitments, circumstances. It is tempting to assume in so-called, what philosophers call post-metaphysical parlance, that a principle like the one articulated in the first clause of German Grundgesetz or the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights could be grounded in the decision of a people, say, the Germans, in view of past horrors and metaphysical guilt, as Jaspers called it, in their decision, in light of this history, to bind themselves to the idea that human dignity is unantastbar. By the same token, the emphasis in the American "we hold this truth to be self-evident" is not on truth and their self-evidence, but rather on we. We hold this truth to be self-evident. These truths matter because this is who we are. So same for the Germans. The Germans would say, Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. This is who we are in relation to our history as Germans. I believe that this answer, which you will get from a host of top current thinkers, is begging the question to its supposed universal content. It undermines the universal scope and the universal authority of human dignity. The most important aspect of propositions like the Declaration of Independence, German Grundgesetz, or the United Nations Universal Declaration is that they do not appeal to we the people, neither to the American people, nor to the German. And by the way, looking forward to international law, one could ask, who is the reference of the we for the UN Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Is it the global public sphere? Is it the we of humanity as a whole? Those are questions that are difficult, and people like Kant and Jürgen Habermas later have views about this, and I will return to challenge those questions as well. In any case, the tendency is to claim that such statements posit an authority that's higher than positivist man-made law, the type that is based on the will of a king, a sovereign, Leviathan, or even democratic consensus. They stand above any will, including the people's. As to scope, so the scope, the universality of a statement like Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar, the claim that human dignity obtains, say, for the German people because of German history, amounts to admitting that it need not apply to others. Other nations, given their own particular history, may not constitute themselves by the obligation to respect human dignity. Here is, for a difficult evening like tonight, an obvious challenge. Say, Jews have a very different history from the Germans. Say, Jews, given their history, may be inclined to say that in the interest of their self-defense, they're entitled to violate this principle. Avoid it in war and avoid it in constitutions that begin with human dignity and may question, say, the idea of Jewish sovereignty, which, let me tell you, is exactly what Zionism consists of. How do Germans, if they ground their commitment to dignity in history, relate to such a claim? And how do they do that all the more given that similar claims could be raised, and obviously are raised, also by others, say Palestinians? To be sure, this is for the time being really not yet about debating the unbearable political content, but rather through that unbearable content to make clear the theoretical point. Once you recognize externally that others may have the right to violate human dignity, you also recognize something internally, in this case, say as Germans, and that is that you cannot claim human dignity as inviolable, for you have recognized your duty to allow that others may have the right to violate it. Insofar as this principle is grounded in history, then, history also limits the scope of your commitment, which is no longer universal. As to authority, if the principle of human dignity is allegedly grounded in a decision of a people to accept it, then that type of grounding is actually the very explanation why that principle is not unantastbar. Whatever depends on the will or the decision of anyone, God, sovereign, the people, is, for this exact reason, antastbar. It's very nice, say, that the Germans have decided now to submit to the notion of human dignity. As we all know, they can also decide otherwise. Less abstractly for a moment, there is a very strong tendency, as I mentioned, to interpret the commitment to human dignity in international, German, and European law as founded upon the recognition of historical crimes, of Holocaust mainly, and of colonialism as well. And even those who are most supportive of international law and of its constitutionalization, and I'm thinking of someone like Jürgen Habermas, explicitly understand its grounding in the history of the Holocaust. And they are to that extent right. International law, as it emerged after the Holocaust, was by far the most robust way to inscribe nie wieder, never again, into human existence in the world. However, at least since October 7th, I think also before, but at least since October 7th, it has and is becoming increasingly clear that history is generating limited, as I said, and contradictory commitments. For post-colonial thinkers, restricting colonized nations through a cosmopolitan idea of humanity seems like a form of neocolonialism, imposing European thinking on its victims, telling them how they are allowed or not allowed to emancipate themselves, while completely failing their protection through international law. I'll return to this, but I'll say already now, we saw that too evidently on October 7th, and we see that still. And for what I think we can call post-Holocaust thinking, as opposed to post-colonialism, the objection, as I hinted before, is actually exactly the same. Just try to suggest that an unqualified commitment to human dignity rather than national sovereignty must stand at the origin of an Israeli constitution, for example. Or hold Israel as strictly accountable to the authority of international law and international courts. One side views such imposition as colonialist, racist, the other as anti-Zionist and thereby anti-Semitic. We saw that, I think, very clearly, not just with the German government's hiccup, to say the least, to publicly recognize the authority of international law with the recent ICC, the International Court, the International Criminal Court, warrants against Israeli leaders suspected of crimes against humanity. We saw that, I think, more interestingly and serious from a philosophical perspective, with normative orders statement. Normative orders is a powerful and important research program that I personally admire despite all criticism. Friends with the managers, and there's some criticism, but it's stated with friendship. We saw this with normative orders statement co-signed by Habermas, titled Principles of Solidarity. The thinker who claimed, that's Habermas, the thinker who claimed that given his own personal history, he cannot engage as a matter of principle in criticisms of the state of Israel, in turn thought that he could participate in determining the limits of legitimate speech about it. While the first position was, in my view, for technical, philosophical reasons that I will not repeat here, mistaken, but of course understandable, the second, the attempt to, from that perspective, determine the limits of speech, was already a contradiction to the very idea of reason, as Habermas himself understands it. Someone who cannot himself pose criticism cannot in turn determine the legitimate limits of a conversation. That would be totalitarian authority, basically. And it's not surprising, in my view, that these contradictions then culminated in the statement's failure to mention the institution of international law as an authority, and in the claim that the accusation of genocide against Israel represents, and this is a quote, a slipping away of all standards of judgment. Now let me underline, regardless of whether the genocide charge is valid or not, I do not enter that here, at least since the International Court of Justice, the ICJ in The Hague, issued urgent legal remedies to Israel based on the authority of the Genocide Convention, at least once the court itself stated, and this is a quote, that the charge is plausible, normative order's position stands in direct clash with the authority of the Court on International Law, suggesting that the court itself is not just right or wrong, but has lost all standards of judgment. That's for a research program that has been perhaps the most supportive in the world of the significance and importance of international law universally and given German history. More specifically, what is at stake with international law is a Kantian project of abolishing the state of nature between states, and that is, I'm still quoting, that is the greatest effort to advance human civilization, end quote. But when asking about the shared commitment, the shared solidarity or public spheres of humans as such on the supranational level that can make international law itself legitimate, what grounds the legitimacy of international law, if not some kind of a shared agreement among humans, something that's very difficult to believe, Habermas responded to that by appealing to what he called, and this is a quote again, the minimal shared sense of outrage at gross violations of human rights. So the claim was that international law requires some form of legitimation from a global public sphere that does not really exist, but we can draw instead on just the common sense that humans as such share the moral outrage against gross, what was it? The gross violations of human rights. And I think we can say that's a problem I really want to put my finger on. What we discover in October 7th, in the global left's response to Hamas' attack on Israeli civilians, on the one hand, the support or toleration of that brutal attack, and then in documents like Principles of Solidarity on the other, is that this alleged shared sense of outrage is exactly not there. We come to notice through the lack of a shared sense of outrage that the grounding of international law in histories of the Holocaust, in histories of colonialism, is actually the Hobbesian move, exactly not Kant's. That is, we try to get civilization and law between states by negative solidarity, the mere fear of war, which is perceived as the father of all things. Exactly not out of Kant's idea of dignity and the corresponding positive ideal of peace, which is independent and beyond historical commitments. We therefore let our what philosophers now would call the very thick cultural commitments, some people speak as Germans, others speak as Israelis, and yet others as French. We let them interfere and even undermine the very thin commitment to human dignity. Overcoming this contradiction is a function that the concept of truth or an ideal such as dignity is supposed to fulfill. if its reality can be defended. While politics, any politics, is a realm in which powers, wills, and positive laws are negotiated, ideals, if they can be true or real, are indifferent to the influence of both. If truth ever does influence politics, it can only be imposed on the political realm from without. In political terms, then, the question is whether human powers, wills, and authorities should be guarded not just by constitutions, checks and balances, and international treaties. They all belong to the political sphere and bend to its principles, but also determined by truth, external authority. Some law would be stated here because it's true. And here lies, I think, the radical promise and the utopian potential that I mentioned, often overlooked, of a principle like that of human dignity. It serves as a portal, the hinge, through which a universalist substance of moral claims is infused into law, connecting a morality that depends on the worth of human persons, a moral claim, with positive, coercive law in national and international institutions. Easy to overlook, but this is not a little matter, because in so-called liberal, neutral orders, we assume that morality has been privatized, similarly to religion, and has been separated from coercive positive law, which, as positivist, can serve rulers, leaders, and general assemblies in order to govern. It is, however, only with a synthesis of human dignity and positive coercive law, bringing them back together, that the Enlightenment separation of morality from law is inverted and the rule of law obtains a substantive significance, presenting a radically different conception of liberal democratic order, where morality isn't separated from law, and the law doesn't serve as a tool or a weapon to rule, but is, so to speak, incorporated as a telos of humanity. Now, the internationalization, making it international, of law is in turn the necessary outcome of its moral metaphysical charging. For the relation between morality and law through dignity gives rise, on a first look, to a contradiction. On the one hand, it is commonly assumed that human dignity can only give rise to protected human rights within particular political communities. It requires a sovereign state, who enforces laws as coercive. So the leviathan of a nation state seems necessary to protect rights. On the other hand, human dignity posits a universalist claim to validity that transcends national boundaries and also questions the authority of positive law. Thus, if morality, or once morality, becomes a part of law and not outside of it, then we get a contradiction between human rights and civil rights. And as we have learned from Kant, there is a way to overcome that contradiction, but that way is in some sense utopian, because it demands that we embrace or adopt a new way of thinking. In this case, that we accept an ideal of a constitutionalized world society, international cosmopolitan law, which extends civic rights beyond boundaries, making humans as such subjects of law, thereby also questioning the rights of sovereign states to violently attack human beings, human dignity. Now, that's basically how Kant argues in Perpetual Peace for the commitment to enter a federative relation between sovereign states, a move from international law that is based on states' absolute sovereignty to a cosmopolitan Zustand that questioned it. That was what Habermas once called Kant's greatest attempt to promote human civilization. Kant's argument was that even though every war is necessarily barbaric, his term, there are actions that ought not be carried out during any armed conflict or violent struggle because they undermine, upon the war's end, peace's very possibility. Kant foresaw that such actions, the ones undermining the possibility of peace, threatened to become models from one war to another, and that they would ultimately lead to what he already called wars of extermination. And he demanded, therefore, to prohibit them by law, something that was completely uncommon. The idea that someone could impose a law on a sovereign seemed to be almost contradictory. It is, from that perspective, not the reality of war as the father of all things, or Hobbes's war of all against all, that is supposed to become the foundation of law, national or international, but the ideal of peace, which, even if it isn't actual, or in fact, exactly because it isn't actual, must be preserved through law as at least a possibility. This argument in Perpetual Peace was published in 1795, and certainly seemed at the time completely utopian. Good in theory, as Kant would say, but not in practice. In our days, however, institutions attempting to guard this very ideal exist. Those are the institutions that were incorporated into international relations after the Second World War in view of the Holocaust's atrocities, with the sort of tribunals that we saw in Nuremberg, and eventually with the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice in The Hague, as well as with doctrines like crimes against humanity and genocide. The innovation that these institutions, post-war institutions, brought to the world in the aftermath of the Holocaust, it is important to notice, runs much deeper than just the prohibition on mass murder. The true achievement lied in the adoption of a cosmopolitan humanist standpoint from which every person, as such, is a subject of law. That is, he or she are protected not only as citizens by their state, but if necessary, also from it, and especially, of course, if they are not citizens at all. Cosmopolitanism here is not just a metaphor. The international community is bound by a legal obligation to protect humans as such, an obligation that is justified primarily by the moral duty to the ideal of humanity and human dignity, not on international treaties or states' consent. That did not exist before the Holocaust. The international community was not violating any law by not interfering in the Holocaust. It has become almost too easy to forget how epoch-making this achievement was. Too easy to overlook that it constituted, as I repeatedly said here, the most substantive attempt to inscribe never again to our life in the world. Now, the most significant critique of this cosmopolitan humanist world order was voiced by one Carl Schmitt. He warned that whereas terms like genocide and crimes against humanity pretend to safeguard peace's possibility and respect for human dignity, those terms, those legal doctrines, crimes against humanity, genocide, they actually achieve the exact opposite. The concept of humanity, Schmitt argued, is in fact an ideological tool, not to say a weapon, that allows one, and this is a quote from Schmitt, to take control of a universal concept, appropriate it to yourself, and deny it from the enemy. Once your enemy has been framed as an enemy of humanity, as a genocidal evil, the argument was, total war aimed at its eradication, its destruction, would be perceived as just. Thus, basing international law in the Kantian universal humanism turns political ideological conflicts into wars of good against evil, depicting the enemy as this is a quote from Schmitt, as a monstrous inhumanity that must not be rejected but destroyed. The crimes that would be committed against those who have committed crimes against humanity, Schmitt warned, and he did this just as the cosmopolitan order was emerging, those crimes would be justified as ones that are necessary to make for humanity, right? To protect humanity. Now, this argument contains, I think, a kernel of truth, and it has been appropriated in our day by both conservative circles and left-leaning post-colonial ones as well. And the reason is that both share a real suspicion against the notion of humanity. Especially post-colonial critics have warned, I think not without reason, that international law and its origin in Enlightenment humanism tends to function as a Western neo-colonial ideology in which indigenous nations are presented as barbarians, especially when engaging in violent armed struggle for emancipation. However, it must be answered, I think it really must be answered, to both sides, conservatives and post-colonial critics, that this Schmittian position in the final analysis is limited and misleading. Categories such as genocide and crimes against humanity are essential and ought to be reinforced. They bring to international law morally laden commitments, but they're actually designed to move violent struggles from the moral and potentially fundamentalistic, austere legal field. That is how they actually are supposed to tame violence, to stop total wars. It was Habermas who correctly answered Schmitt's argument by noting that Schmitt's position runs into a void. Ultimately, he argued correctly, the commitment to move beyond state sovereignty in grounding cosmopolitanism transforms violent struggles from the realm of just and unjust wars, which may allow for moral fundamentalism, into the framework of legal and illegal wars, which prevents it. It will be the court who will decide what's legal and what's not ideologies, say, of hate. So it's not truth anymore, it's law. That's a distinction that I think we must preserve today, in full knowledge that it draws on a fine and volatile distinction. On the one hand, institutions of international law must intervene to prevent the crimes that have been committed and bound to unfold in the context of the total war logic that's developing now in the region of Israel and Palestine, including programs of the sort that were just offered by the American president for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and have been endorsed, one must say, enthusiastically in Israel all across the political spectrum. That's why law matters. These plans are being drawn because international law has not been applied for years. A failure, we now know, that did not just undermine justice. That, I think, a takeaway from this lecture. The point is not that not applying law undermines justice, but rather the problem is that this brought about unspeakable violence on both sides. Violence that follows from the impossibility of peace. The task of international law is not to ground justice, but to ground peace. And yet, and this is now very important, for the exact same reason, that is, because a region is descending into total war, it is also dangerous, I want to say just as Schmitt warned, to use categories like genocide and crimes against humanity, not as legal categories, but as ideological weapons that may totalize wars and deepen them, presenting your enemy as inhuman, rather than serve for their prevention. In this regard, I want to warn, when looking at October 7th on the one side and Gaza's destruction on the other, we can say that all sides have been utterly failing. On the Israeli side, the tendency here is clear, not only among speakers like Yoav Gallant, the previous Minister of Defense, who said something like, "We're fighting subhuman animals," or Yair Golan, the leader of the emerging left, who said, "We must not allow any humanitarian efforts, let them starve to death," partly because neither Golan nor Gallant are supposed to be humane symbols. By contrast, David Grossman recently spoke in Germany upon receiving the Heine Prize, stating, and I quote, "In my book, See Under Love, I described a Nazi officer. I suffered a lot from working on this character, but I wanted to understand how a normal, reasonable person turns into a Nazi. But a Hamas murderer who on October 7th slit open pregnant women and killed babies has, in my opinion, taken themselves out of humanity." Now, many questions arise from reading these lines, but I set them aside. Grossman is rightly, I want to underline that, Grossman is rightly considered the compass of Israeli humanity. And indeed, one of his greatest achievements was his ability to portray in Hebrew Nazis as human criminals, not monsters. And at exactly from that humanist standpoint, speaking as the one for whom nothing human is alien, Grossman turns to exclude Hamas from the circle of humanity. And I want to point out the hard-won achievement of treating even Nazis as human criminals, not monsters. An achievement which is inseparable from the cosmopolitan duty I mentioned to defend all humans as such. Those things go hand in hand. Is with this statement undermined if it is instrumentalized to then exclude Hamas murderers, and they are murderers, from the circle of humanity? It is difficult, I think, to separate the failure of Israel's left to oppose the country's crimes in Gaza from the tendency to treat Hamas as a mythical enemy which must be uprooted from a society that supports it. Another important example can be found in an influential article from November 2023, so very soon after the massacre, by the professors David Enoch and Barak Medina, professors of philosophy and law at Oxford and the Hebrew University, where Medina also served as a rector. According to Enoch and Medina, since Hamas has repeatedly committed, quote, grave crimes against humanity and can be expected to repeat them, the threat that it poses justifies, quote, attempting to kill anyone who is associated with the organization directly or indirectly in order to prevent the threat from materializing, end quote. It is important to emphasize, however, that Hamas, a terrorist organization, does not incorporate directly only combatants, but also university lecturers, social workers, religious leaders, and say hospital directors, and those are by law not legal military targets. One must also ask, who is indirectly affiliated with Hamas? The answer is vague and could include, in fact, almost the whole of Gaza's population. In other words, based on the correct, I want to underline, correct premise that Hamas has committed grave crimes against humanity, Enoch and Medina, who are themselves fighters for peace in Israel, Enoch and Medina essentially concluded that it is possible to collapse the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, the same distinction that was set in international law to prevent total wars in the first place, to ensure that wars remain between combatants and do not become wars between peoples, between Jews and Palestinians. Right? Now, I don't know if pointing out this failed transition sounds like a minor detail, like a minor nuance. To understand the significance of this argument, it may be useful to imagine that someone would make the reverse argument. Namely, that the IDF has repeatedly committed, quote, I'm quoting from Medina and Enoch, grave crimes against humanity, and that the threat is significant enough to justify the attempt, quote, to kill anyone associated with the IDF directly or indirectly. The first part of the statement is unfortunately more than plausible. It was asserted by the International Criminal Court. But the horrific conclusion, would turn many Israeli non-combatants and civilians into legitimate targets. I wanted to see that that is in fact what was done by the argument against Hamas. And indeed, the problem is that this logic has become common. It has. Andreas Malm, a well-known authority on global warming, claims today, quote from a book that's being celebrated, definitely in the US, quote, the destruction of Gaza is a destruction of the world. He begins his analysis by stating, quote, the second thing we thought after October 7th was they will destroy Gaza. They will kill everyone. The first thing we expressed in those early hours was not words, but cries of joy. What he calls the Zionist genocide in Gaza is depicted as the epitome of the Western destruction, not of humanity, but of the world. I want to say, anyone seeking to discuss accusations of genocide or crimes against humanity on an austere legal and factual basis must reject such arguments with revulsion. It has become necessary to do so for tolerating the pernicious conceptual links that some, frankly many, have established between legal terms, international legal terms, and the dehumanization of Israeli society to the point of justifying Hamas crimes undermines the legitimacy of international law. It is no coincidence that those who first use the term genocide and label now those who avoid it genocide deniers were the same as those who shouted with joy, or at least tolerated, the crimes on October 7th. For those who now ask to reduce Zionism to genocidal colonialism, the distinction between Israeli combatants and civilians, a distinction enshrined in law, questions Palestinians' right to resist by some neo-colonial international law. And the question of attacking Israeli civilians is no longer presented as that of killing civilians, but of the killing of settlers, as a chapter title in Malm's book reads. Such logic does not seek, for example, a constitutional revision in Israel, one resulting in a federative binational constellation between the river and the sea, as attempting to preserve the possibility of peace. In a way, just the opposite. It is a justification of the idea that Jewish national self-determination is inherently genocidal and must disappear from the world. We must resist, I think, the temptation to respond to the dehumanization of Palestinians, which we must warn about. We must resist the temptation to respond to it with the dehumanization of Israelis. If I'm not mistaken, Habermas recognized this danger. This explains, or can explain, the aforementioned statement here list with normative orders, which I mentioned, including the claim that accusing Israel of genocide implies having lost all standards of justice, of judgment. We can perhaps deduce from the aforementioned Habermasian answer to Schmitt the reason for this statement, namely the fear that Schmitt's warning regarding the moral, ideological abuse of categories like crimes against humanity and genocide would now, by a horrifying irony, apply to Israelis in order to frame them as enemies of humanity. That would almost make international law, some people call it neocolonialist, that would make international law anti-Semitic. However, as said, at least since the International Court of Justice in The Hague deemed the genocide case that was brought by South Africa to be plausible and urgently called on Israel to take action under the Genocide Convention, Habermas' position is now on collision course with the standard of the court. I want to suggest that standing by the Kantian project of a humanist cosmopolitan order would have demanded here a different response. The commitment to follow, even with the limiting, difficult test cases of genocide and crimes against humanity, strict legal categories. The standards of judgment are set by international law and by the international conventions as interpreted by the recognized international tribunals. That's the only way to separate those terms from ideological abuse. And here lies also the key to the position that I think we, that is now Israelis, together with our Palestinian friends, urgently need to adopt while unspeakable crimes are being committed, both sides. Proposals for ethnic cleansing are being suggested and endorsed. Bombings just now returned to Gaza and violence spreads rashly into the West Bank. And the Israeli rule of law, which in the first place has failed to protect Palestinians, that rule of law is now under pressure to the point of civil war. First, speak as civilians who wish to protect civilians, Israelis or Palestinians, and demand in the name of that the strengthening of international law. In doing so, I now say Israelis and Palestinians, will not just take the necessary step to prevent the worst, which I think all of us fear is coming. We'll also make the first leap in the crossing of a Rubicon by changing the perspective and choosing to protect all humans in the territory between the river and the sea. This leap points the way to the essential reconstruction for peace and rule of law, according to the difficult to realize ideal of confederation between Jews and Palestinians, not the absolute commitment to sovereign leviathans, national leviathans, under the banner of an imagined separation. That logic that I think, and I would argue, has already brought us to where we are. it is true that the very coherence of a post-war cosmopolitan humanist project is being tested by the example that we will set in the world after Gaza. All the more reason today to continue defending the achievement of establishing law in humanism, using it as a powerful tool to counter the forces that have already led to total war, but not as a weapon in their hands. It makes all the difference now in our current actions tomorrow, not in some utopia. If the ideal of human dignity and the corresponding affirmation of the inherent relation between law and peace will be taken to be the beginnings of our politics, governments, and international legislation, and not the allegedly real reality of violence or the presumed necessity of war. The ideal of human dignity is real then, and war cannot be the father of all things because it is not its origin. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen Dank, lieber Omri Boehm. Das war eine aufregende Vorlesung, ein aufregender Vortrag, der direkt in die Problematik unserer Welt heute, vor der wir heute stehen, hineingegangen ist. Zum Schluss sehr pointiert auf die Situation in Palästina und Israel auch eingegangen. Wir wollen jetzt ein bisschen darüber diskutieren. Sie haben gleich die Möglichkeit, sich an der Diskussion zu beteiligen, sich einzubringen, Fragen zu stellen oder Kommentare dazu zu geben. Das wird sicher sehr spannend werden. Ich möchte aber zunächst mal eine Frage stellen, die noch mal ganz zurück ins Grundsätzliche geht. Und zwar, Sie haben so schön das Grundgesetz angesprochen. Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. Das ist 1949 verabschiedet worden als Reaktion auf den Holocaust, auf die Nazi-Zeit. Nun ist aber ja das, was da als Würde des Menschen verstanden wurde 1949, juristisch gesehen fast eine Lehrformel gewesen. Man kann den Holocaust kann man anführen als eine Füllung, aber dann hört es auch schon bald auf. Wenn man sich real anschaut, wie das, was Würde des Menschen ist, dann in der deutschen Rechtsentwicklung vollzogen hat, dann hat es ewig gedauert, bis die Würde der Frauen anerkannt wurde. Es hat ewig gedauert, bis die Würde der Homosexuellen anerkannt wurde. Und ich kann mich noch daran erinnern, dass Gustav Heinemann, einer der wirklich großen Präsidenten, den wir hier in Deutschland hatten, noch in den 70er Jahren davon gesprochen hat, dass die Menschenrechte keine deutsche Rechtskonstruktion seien, weil das sei viel zu individualistisch gedacht, die Menschenrechte. Menschenrechte müsste man viel kollektiver auffassen, so ein bisschen wie die Chinesen das wahrscheinlich heute tun. Das war seine sozialdemokratische deutsche Weltsicht, die er noch in den Jahren brachte. Und viele, zum Beispiel die evangelische Kirche, hat sich erst in den 80er, 90er Jahren mit den Menschenrechten des Grundgesetzes und damit wirklich identifiziert. Es hat ewig gedauert, bis sich das durchgesetzt hat. Und deswegen meine grundsätzliche Frage mal an Sie und an Ihr Konzept. Welche Rolle spielen Lernprozesse in dem, was Sie gesagt haben? Also es klingt ja so ein bisschen so, als wäre da ein Prinzip und das müsste man durchsetzen. Aber dieses Prinzip, was man durchsetzen müsste, hat sich über Jahrhunderte entwickelt. Es ging immer ein Stück weiter, es hat sich ausgedehnt, es hat mehr umfasst. Muss man nicht das Ganze immer in dieser Hinsicht relativieren und dann eben von Lernprozessen sprechen?
I think the short answer is yes. We say human dignity is inviolable. What follows from this still needs to be negotiated, learned, understood through history and so forth. This is, it would be wonderful if we knew the truth about human dignity with certainty, and we could say, look, here is what follows from it, here is what doesn't follow from it, and law would just unfold from that premise. in ways that, we don't have to learn, we don't have to think, we don't have to. That is, in an interesting way, already shows you part of my answer, that in some sense would violate enlightenment. It will give us the answers rather than demand something from us to learn. I think the principle of human dignity is important. There was a real achievement in the moment in which it was incorporated into law, something that was far from obvious. The principle of being a principle of arguing for something, we can try to ask what that something is, and I can say some words about that, is a principle, but debates can follow. We can progress. We can regress also, right? It is not the final answer. It gives you a principle and a logic in which to have a conversation. That's actually something that's very essential about that principle. But it does already incorporate, because of its form, some progresses that are, so to speak, built in. Some things would be, I think, immediately crossed out if human dignity is unantastbar. Some, what I call this utopian potential, is already built into law once you have introduced it, right? The tension between the concept of humanity and the concept of citizenship is already there. That is not necessary in a constitution. The Americans, for example, the Americans do not have that. Here is an interesting fact about the Americans. They have the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's not part of the Constitution. Then there is the Constitution. We, the people of America, blah, 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 blah. The notion of humanity is not part of coercive positive law. Once a certain moral notion of humanity and its dignity is written in law, something new has happened.
Okay, so, das war meine Frage. Jetzt sind Sie dran. Wer möchte schon mal hier eine Frage stellen, einen Kommentar geben? Bitte, seien Sie mutig, melden Sie sich. Es darf alles gefragt werden. Bitte, da hinten, hier haben wir eine Wortmeldung. Frau Begerotzki. Mikro kommt.
So I can ask in English. Thanks a lot. My question is related to emotion and trauma. So how can an emotionalized society, community, let's say even the diaspora, overcome a collective trauma like the 7th of October regarding the Holocaust and a lot of migration and all the trauma that has been related to Jewish segregation throughout history, and overcome these emotions and rationalize into an idea of everlasting partnership. So I don't see where our community right now, I'm Jewish myself, can overcome the trauma in an international setting like we have it right now to be the bridge builder, let's call it that way. Thank you.
I cannot argue with you. And the reason why I cannot argue with you is that you were expressing your own feelings. And they are as such. You're the only one who decides whether they're true or not. I believe you that this is how you feel. And I know very well from my surroundings, from myself, that those feelings are shared by many people. I would argue two things. First, they're not shared by everybody. Second, I would argue that, in fact, the existence of those feelings, no matter how justified, by the way, also among Palestinians who feel the same, some would say with no lesser justification if you look at Gaza today and the response in the world. You know, a Palestinian tells you, I'm sorry, you want to talk to me about universal solidarity? That's very nice. Not interested. And I will understand. my only answers are, there is one answer that really has two parts. One is, I think that the fact that trauma and emotions that are prevalent in our world, for good reasons, cannot generate the mechanisms that would lead to peace, that gives us the best argument why emotions and trauma need to be understood and respected, but cannot be the principles upon which our society is founded. The principles need to be human dignity and law. If trauma will be the principle, we will be killing each other. By the way, you and I as Jews, I don't know even what we'll be doing in this room, which is German, if we cannot overcome it through law, for example, right? With all due respect to Hamas and the Palestinians, I mean, overcoming trauma if overcoming trauma would be impossible, then we will not be having this conversation here. I'm glad that we are having it here. That's one thing. The second thing is, what can be that bridge that does the magic, moving from the abstract ideal of human dignity to concrete reality where you say, here is where I take the leap, and I actually walk towards that solidarity. And that is what I was trying to argue in another article. I was trying to use a notion of friendship to do that. And I was arguing that the friendship, say, between Jews and Palestinians, the personal friendship, it is personal on the one hand, but it is not just personal. It is, in fact, also political. Because the existence of this friendship allows you to see how you can overcome bits and pieces of those traumas together, to refuse the denial of dignity that I think we see on both sides, all around us, with Palestinian friends. My Palestinian friends would not accept the way some people speak about Israeli Jews today. They just cannot accept it. And I cannot accept the way many people speak about Palestinians today. This commitment of friendship, making its appearance in the public sphere, is at least the first step.
I could ask you Hebrew, but I don't do it. So I am very glad to see you here in Hannover, and thank you very much for your lecture. And as I know, you are not only a philosopher, you are a practical guy. So therefore, I prepared 3 questions, because I am a rabbi, I am a Jew, I am an Israeli, an old Israeli soldier, but first of all, I am a mensch. That's on the top. Thank you. So, 3 questions I have. Is there a realistic hope that the many NGOs that do an incredible work for understanding and reconciliations between Jews and Palestinians will have a decisive influence on the majority of conservative, right-wing, nationalist, ultra-Orthodox population in Israel in the foreseeable future? The second question, unfortunately, I don't hear or I don't know NGOs on the Palestinian side in the West Bank or abroad. Maybe you can name one of. And the third question, can you name Arab and Palestinian intellectuals who write such articles about Palestine, West Bank, Lebanon, Gaza, Syria in newspapers, such as Gideon Levy, Moshe Zuckerman, Moshe Zimmerman about Israel? Maybe you can name a few. I beg your pardon, but these are practical questions. I am working together with my Palestinian friends here in Hannover. So therefore, I need some practical answers. תודה רבה.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do I think that it's realistic to hope that the NGOs working in Israel can have a positive effect on the situation? Look, I was sitting 2 days ago with actually a very prominent professor of international law at NYU in New York, and we were discussing. And he told me, Omri, you're completely crazy. By the way, not all people think so. So, you know, what are the chances that a politics like yours can one day become mainstream? I told him, you grew up in Jerusalem. Let's live, not you, but he. Or as my parents. You must know Itamar Ben-Gvir from the streets. He was a crazy nobody. No one could have ever imagined that Itamar Ben-Gvir will not just become the Minister of Internal Affairs, Internal Security, but that, let's be honest now, but that his politics will become the dominating force of the government, not Bibi's, Ben-Gvir's. Look, the ways we do not know the future. What I think those organizations are doing, what we need to make sure, I think, is two things. First, that they remain in place and that they will do their work, something that we are not certain that will happen because everybody's crushing them. The Israeli government is making them criminal. The German government, for fears of accusations of anti-Semitism, is cutting their funding. It's becoming very difficult. Second, we need to do another thing. Let me tell you something from the other side. We need to make sure that the language that they use is not hijacked into the just anti-Israeli lingo, something that I was doing to do in the talk here, to show, look, it is very dangerous that the concepts that people are using now to understand, describe and understand the situation will only give you the framework to delegitimize Israeli society. By the way, also for Israeli Jews, for the organizations that you may be referring to. And I think we need to show, that's part of my own project, that we have a framework that's different also for them, that they can work with it in order to survive. If they continue to do that, we can actually have hope, and it's realistic. Things are about to happen. Changes, historical changes are coming. Not all of them are for the better, but at some point, there will have to be also a change for the better. And the question is whether at that moment there will be a framework giving an alternative or it will have died. And I think this is really what, at this point, we need to do here. So very modest, but not really. NGOs on the Palestinian side. Look, I'll give you an example. Adala in Haifa. It's a wonderful organization, in my view. It is very clear about Israeli crimes, has been for years, but precisely for that reason, immediately, for example, after October 7th, Adala is a Palestinian-Israeli organization. Something that my friends in New York, my colleagues, forget friends, my colleagues in New York failed to do, immediately released a statement saying clearly that what Hamas did is a serious crime, that it is crime by the standard of cosmopolitan international law and so forth. Something that, again, is just not the framework offered, say, in New York. The fact that Palestinians, Israelis, who, as you would know, suffer a lot, and know the discrimination firsthand, and it's not discrimination, it's violence to them, can do that, shows you that Palestinian society, which is not strong and has been, under a lot of pressure, by all means produces excellent alternatives. I have a lot of hope when I look at Israeli-Palestinian members of parliament. They are wonderful. They are probably the best now in the Israeli parliament, which is, you know, unfortunate. I say this as an Israeli patriot, is losing the power and the beauties that it used to have. The best parliamentaries are Israeli Palestinians who on the one hand really insist on the rights of Palestinians, but speak very clearly about the need for cohabitation with Jews, about the need to commemorate the Holocaust. You know, I would commemorate the Holocaust with Ahmad Tibi much before I would do this with Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bibi Netanyahu, out of genuine commitment to this history. So the alternatives exist. I agree that one could always hope for more, but the appeal to those leaders and those organizations exist. I take this to basically also answer the third question, which was similar to the second. If you need to appeal to a text, appeal to how about Ahmad Tibi's Holocaust Memorial speech, or Mansour Abbas' Holocaust Memorial speech. They are very clear about their perspective.
Okay, I think what you're discussing is the question of advocacy, isn't it? Advocacy. Also, that's a big problem in these. You need advocates in a situation of inequality. You need these people from the more powerful side to take side of the lesser powerful people, and who is able to do that? Who is able to be an advocate for the others?
It is becoming very difficult for Palestinians. Well, it is not easy for Jews, but they exist. Yeah. It is becoming more difficult for Palestinians to say advocate for cohabitation with Jews. Yeah. The reason is that they do not have a state. When people tell me, I dislike this type of criticism, but sometimes it's not, it has a good point. People say, check your privilege. You want to have a joint politics with Palestinians? That's very nice. You speak as an Israeli citizen where a Jewish state exists, and you're asking from the leaders of the Palestinian side who do not have citizenship and do not have a state to give up on the claim. And you think you will come together as if you're equal partners. The answer that I have to this is, you're right. It takes a leap of faith, but I think it takes that leap of faith. And the people who will have to take it, some of them are there, slowly emerging.
Okay. Thank you very much for your very great talk, and I learned a lot from it. But I'm not sure if I paid attention enough or whether there's a small inconsistency I noted. I think, and I'm going back to the realm of philosophy and away from Israel-Palestine for a moment. I think you said that it is necessary for law to be grounded in some sort of truth, or for us holding on to this belief that law is somehow rooted in something deeper than sovereignty or a king or even God. But then when you talked about the need for international law when it comes to dealing with genocide, you said it's very important to have this legal international framework for it in order to become not ideologically driven, but to be just in a legal setting. But if I understand you correctly, all this legal setting, be it nations of the nation state or the international era, to your assessment should always be grounded in a moral framework, in truth, in the end. So let's say then it's just a matter of modal shift. It is somehow institutionalized that maybe takes out the heat of it, but it's not something essentially different from a moral perspective, but it's just moral, institutionalized in law. And it leads me to a second little point. If you said like in the international arena, it's not about the courts or the legal system establishing justice, but peace. I wonder if really, law, and be it international law, is grounded in truth, and isn't then, also justice the ultimate aim of law, even in the international arena, because peace might be a little shallow. If everybody is treated with dignity, has basic rights like freedom of speech and religion, it's just a matter of principle, or just a very natural fact that I am not allowed to attack another person. So justice encompasses peace, and justice is more, the bigger concept. Thank you.
Really wonderful, thank you. And I will not be able to answer all of that, but I think this is exactly, first, not by means of giving the washy academic answer, this requires more research. But rather, I completely agree that this is at least some of the thoughts that do require such more research. However, I do have some answers also. And and I think I understood. I think I understood the question, though by the time that I started thinking about the last part of the question, I a little bit forgot my answer to the first part. But I think the following. If we think that there can be international law between states, not just international, but cosmopolitan, that is, not just the law that regulates the relations between states, but also refers, in fact, also to individuals within those states as subjects of the international law, such that those individuals are subjects of the international law also, and not just of their own sovereign states. In order to think that law is legitimate, we need to ask, okay, what is the ground of its legitimacy? And the ground of its legitimacy can be, let's say, God. That's the liberal tradition. God gave humans rights, and now the question is just, how you protect them. But humans as such have rights. And that would be, it's legitimate because God gave it. This is, by the way, not the argument that I was running there. It's a slightly different argument. But it's about international law and not about, in general, constitution. That is obviously not going to do the trick. Another option, which is the Habermasian option, by the way, is to say we do need a public sphere, we need a certain democratic constellation where we discuss together laws in order to confer legitimacy on laws together, and where you can imagine such a public sphere. You can, at least as an ideal, imagine international law having legitimacy because a certain global public sphere can confer legitimacy on that law. I think that was the trend, and that is where the research claim is going to be introduced. The point that I was trying to make, and we'll have to go into research now, is to say, look, that answer actually collapses. It collapses because the shared consensus against grave violation of human rights does not exist. Given people's conflicting histories, they are willing to tolerate the grave violence to others if this serves their own history, their own identity. And the question is what to do about international law in view of that, where my position is, well, we need to see whether we can stand by human dignity as something that is a real ideal, not one that's coming from God, but also not coming from public consensus. but rather is metaphysical in that notion. So for those who know my book on radical universalism, where I was at least trying to suggest we do need to rehabilitate metaphysics, the question is how to think that metaphysical aspect now much more concretely in relation, say, to the legitimacy of international law as grounded in dignity. This is all to answer only the first part of your question. The second part of the question about maybe a contradiction or I don't think so. It's possible that I spoke uncarefully. If I understood you correctly, it's possible that I was somewhat not careful when I at some point said moral ideological. I think that even if law needs to be charged with morality, in order to make humans as such subjects of law, once we have, say, claims about genocide or ethnic cleansing, they have moved from the realm of morality and ideology to the realm of law. This is now to be verified in the courts. This is not me. That's always a question of taking the law into your own hands. Someone, I don't know, God forbid, raped my daughter. I don't have a daughter, right? So, and I'll go and I'll kill them, right? That is a moment where someone could say, well, morally, maybe I can justify what you're doing. But no, we have taken that to the realm of law, and we say only law will take care of this. It separates that from fundamentalism. The law itself is charged with morality, but it actually it takes away the heated nature of moral ideological violence into a legal setting.
Yes. I have a question with regard to David Grossman. You were citing him and his novel Ayin Erech Ahava. You said that he managed to call a Nazi perpetrator as a human being, but failed to do so when looking at the Hamas terrorists and their atrocities. And today I would sign that as a Jew, as an Israeli. And I also agree with the first speaker who said that the Holocaust is still a lingering trauma, but we have the distance of time. And the 7th of October was and is imminent for David Grossman, for us Israelis, including you. And I love most of what you're saying, most of your ideas, but I see that all the great ideas, very sorry to say so, very often come from our side, the Jewish side. And I'm also thinking of Oded Lifshitz, one of the hostages, who was working tirelessly for peace and coexistence with his Palestinian neighbors. And he was driving children to hospitals in Israel, and he helped. And I know this is very Israeli to say this, he got stabbed in the back. And I always think it's so one-sided. I know there are a lot of Arabs, Palestinians, also my friends, intellectuals who feel the same, but they're not the majority. And I see the evil on the Israeli side as well. Yet, still, I always think we are the ones who think so much and try so much and offer again and again and again and always get slapped in the end. And then I feel really the lack of empathy worldwide. I look at the ICC, sorry, my last comment, and I would love to hear your idea. It says that they have to protect every citizen, even if he doesn't have a state. Am I correct? Yes? what about Palestinians? They cannot be charged with a crime of genocide because they do not have a state. And so they get away with a genocide they started and put on their carta, and we all know this is their goal. But they cannot be charged with genocide. Israel can.
All right, thank you very much. This is all very important. A few comments. First, as I mentioned to the lady who asked the first question, and whose name I'm sorry, I don't remember, I cannot argue with the way you feel. And I don't want to argue with the way you feel, especially that I have so much understanding to the way you feel. And by the way, it's not stated to be nice. It's stated genuinely. I know how people feel, and they have good reasons to feel that. However, I think that there are some issues of principle that I would like to argue with you about. Frankly, I was very cautious with David Grossman. I think that the statement includes things that are important to criticize that I was deliberately pushing aside. I think that the claim, especially made in Germany, that in some way Hamas is worse than Nazis, or that you can accept Nazis as humans but not Hamas, is not a good one. Is really much beyond the question of humanism. So I would disagree, not with how you feel, but I would disagree with anyone who would tell me that somehow they can view Nazis as humans but not Hamas. Yeah. That's for that. And I would argue, regardless of the question who you can regard as human or not, I would argue that the only way, and that I allow myself to say as a philosopher, and I would try to make the arguments if I had to, this is not a philosophy class, the only way to insist on international cosmopolitan law as it emerged after the Holocaust, those things go hand in hand. First, we have to protect civilians or humans as such as subjects of law, but it is inseparable from that you would view, say in this case, the Nazi perpetrators as human criminals and not as monsters. If you do not do that, you will not be able to have your cosmopolitan law as something legitimate. That's one. Second, I want to suggest that at least from your logic, I want to show you at least the danger. It's possible that this is our world. We look at Hamas murderers and we say those are not humans. But I want to point out that the danger that people are looking at what Israel is doing in Gaza and saying those Israelis are not humans is there. And let's say if your position here would be reasonable, theirs would not necessarily be less reasonable. I want to create the framework in which we can say, look, I respect genuinely, though, respect how you feel about that. Let the principles that guard our coexistence in Israel, in Palestine, and in the world not be based on those feelings. Everybody is human, no matter what. Law needs to be the medium in which we treat each other. If we start saying those are not humans, then we're not treating them as criminals. We're treating them, as Yoav Gallant said, as animals. And this is, we dehumanize ourselves in this way, and they will treat us as such, and they are. As to your political judgment about we constantly try, and I don't see this on the other side, I beg to disagree. I think that that's, frankly, again, I say this with pain and with respect and with love to David Grossman and knowing his suffering. That's actually why I allow myself to criticize him. He is the symbol of Israeli humanity. No one is better than David Grossman. But that is his position. In that context, we need to notice that your claim that we are constantly trying is missing. We're not constantly trying. The principles of genuine equality are not there. You told me about one hostage, Chaim Perry, who was another person who fought for peace, was a friend of the family, who was killed in Gaza as a hostage, was for years standing on the border to Gaza, protesting against the occupation. I'm aware, I don't know how many of the more than 50 people who were killed in Gaza actually supported peace with Jews. I definitely know many Palestinians who support that and probably felt betrayed. I do not share the claim that so many Israelis are fighting for peace and not Palestinians. I think that what is perceived as a fight for peace is very different on both sides, and as it is interpreted in some circles of the international community, where I take, frankly, almost everybody to be wrong. Those who look at people like Aharon Barak or David Grossman as fighters for peace, I think you'll have to look more carefully. Aharon Barak has a heroic, in some view, president of the Israeli Supreme Court who did a lot for human rights. He legitimized the occupation. He allowed the building of the settlements. He allowed expulsions. All are violations by international law. The view who supports peace and is constantly fighting for it but is getting betrayed, I think needs to shift. It needs to shift in that moment, which is really historical. We need to ask ourselves, what are really the conditions of peace in the region? What are they really? Where equality is not the utopian end, but the beginning of the conversation. And after we ask that, I think we'll find that, unfortunately, it's stated with love, David Grossman is not that. Aharon Barak is not that. God forbid, the discussion emerging now in New York is also not that. We need something else. That is my challenge to you. Yeah. Sorry for my long response.
Vielen Dank. Haben wir noch? Gut, letzte Frage jetzt.
Okay.
Haben wir noch mehr? Haben wir noch mehr Fragen? Nö, ne? Okay, eine Frage noch.
I'm again going back into the more abstract realm. In short, my question is, to what extent do you consider law in general and international law in particular also a preventative measure towards conflict, war, or crime, or just a reactive thing? Because in law, you start with the father of all things, like war or human dignity and so on. To me, it always was human dignity. I feel there is proof in the numbers of, like, with the exception of very, very few people with rare personality disorders, I feel the proof is in the numbers of people who carry away trauma, not only as victims of crimes or survivors of crimes, but also as onlookers or as the violators in those crimes. And it's not only like murder and torture, it's also like just observing living conditions that we consider inhumane. Like, we all carry away trauma from that, and the more it is from the heat of moment, whether the committing of crimes or whatever, and the less it has built up beforehand, the higher those trauma, or the stronger those traumas are. And so I feel like this human dignity has always been there, not in this empty shell. It is in the German national law or UN Charter or so ever, I would bet that one could even like scientifically research the numbers of like how people react to certain things and very clearly define like what we feel as unjust. And that brings me what you led on with later on is the dehumanization we also just talked about. And that kind of is that build-up that happens in interpersonal crimes, that also happens in the international atrocities and all other things that happen. Like the longer and the more effective this dehumanization is built up, the less trauma is drawn away from the crimes. And of course that brings up the question how long that has been there or where it comes from. I mean, from like military history, like I know Napoleon Bonaparte to have been like the first to rationally use it for war as an instrument to like bring that national anger and dehumanization into war. But the other question is like, has it always been there? Are there people like having an intention to bring it around or whatever? But at the end, I feel like preventing those crimes on every level is preventing this dehumanization. And I'm not sure to what extent law can cover that.
Okay, thank you.
I think that to a large extent you're right that a certain feeling of dignity, I don't know if it always was there, but I agree that it was there first before it was articulated in this way. One of the people who articulates it in the best way is Immanuel Kant. I don't think he invented it. I think he found a way to articulate the meaning of the claim. But by the way, he would have said the same, and it would have been important for him. That's something that's actually grasped by any human being intuitively, and that he only manages to describe this as a theoretical in a meta level, theoretical principle. However, if it is broadly Kant who describes dignity so well, not for the first time, but let's say a benchmark, the interesting fact is that you still do not find that notion in constitutions, in declarations, and so forth. The American Declaration of Independence has no appeal to dignity, for example. You might find it weird. It's an interesting fact. It is in post-war, post-Holocaust constitutions and treaties that the notion of dignity suddenly finds its way into law in order to now have a retrospective reinterpretation of what was it that was violated. That's one thing. The second, but this has consequences, and I was trying to speak about those consequences. That's one. For the second thing, the question of the dehumanization. Let's, I try to remain brief. The danger that I wanted to spell out, and that I think is in dialogue with what you're saying, is that exactly from the logic of dignity and humanism, there is an inherent danger that lingo is a lingo of dehumanization. Once you humanize, you actually dehumanize those who do not behave according to those standards. And I think that it is very true that once that is your perspective, it is very dangerous, as Schmitt. This is Schmitt's warning, right? He was also a Nazi, but that warning needs to be heard. It is, if you speak as a humanist, you have the danger of dehumanizing others and accepting crimes against them. The solution to this that I was trying to push is, well, maybe that's right. The solution is that this is why the humanist logic necessitates the transition to the realm of law. once you embrace humanism, the only way to prevent that consequences, by the way, this is not me too original here, the only way to overcome that danger is to insist that that notion of humanism has to be articulated through law and not through morality. Because then you are with moral fundamentalism.
Omri Boehm, vielen Dank, das war großartig. Also das war nun wirklich ein hochkomplexer Vortrag und dann noch hier eine komplexe Diskussion. Toll, super. Schön, dass Sie das hier mit uns gemacht haben. Die Argumente werden uns noch lange beschäftigen. Wir werden noch viel diskutieren. Auch schön, dass wir jetzt mal diese provisorische Übersetzung haben. Da können wir uns ein bisschen darauf beziehen. Das ist sehr schön. Und wir werden weiter darüber diskutieren. Meine Damen und Herren, damit ist die Vortragsreihe jetzt hier bis auf den siebten Vortrag soweit erstmal beendet und ich möchte an dieser Stelle vor allen Dingen der Volkswagen Stiftung jetzt nochmal ganz herzlich danken, dass Sie uns hier zweimal eingeladen haben in diesen wunderbaren Vortragssaal hier, großartig. Ist ja nicht nur, dass Sie uns hier eingeladen haben, sondern Sie haben auch sonst zu den Kosten der Veranstaltung ganz viel beigetragen. Ohne Sie wäre das gar nicht möglich gewesen. Also das ist ganz toll. Und Sie können jetzt das auch noch ein bisschen genießen, weil draußen gibt es noch ein Glas Wein und auch noch ein paar andere Dinge, wozu ich Sie herzlich seitens der Volkswagen Stiftung auch noch einladen darf. Also bleiben Sie noch einen Augenblick, lassen Sie uns noch einen Augenblick miteinander reden. Das lohnt sich auf jeden Fall. Und Herr Boehm ist auch noch hier. Kaufen Sie auch seine Bücher, die gibt es da oben. Also das lohnt sich auch. Das ist ganz wichtig, dass Sie das auch machen. Und das war es jetzt erstmal. Kommen Sie alle gut nach Hause und auf Wiedersehen.